Hi everybody, thanks for coming. My name's Ben Almadi. I'm the technical manager for the cosmetics side of the business at MSL. I'm a microbiologist by trade. And today we're going to go through some considerations for progressive cosmetics. So what we'll start with is good manufacturing practice, and then we'll move into the more niche areas like reusable packaging, refill stations. The reason why I've done the good manufacturing practice first is because the refill stations, for example, have now extended the manufacturing line you could consider in a way, because finished product isn't being developed until it's actually in store or even in people's homes. So there are different risks that we need to consider. After that, we'll follow into building a testing strategy, and then we'll move on to Vegan Sure, which is a vegan way of testing, but it's been expanded. So GMP, what actually is it? So I personally do quite a lot of GMP audits for MSL. So we will go to the site, we typically check stuff like hygiene policy, your training, your recall procedures. I've dealt with 3 recalls this year, and they're all to do with one root cause that we can go through. And then we'll be checking whether you're doing internal audits. So internal audits, should they then be going towards the stores? That's something we need to consider later on. And are the changes effective? Typically, you would expect that you're testing your water, your environmentals, is your cleaning procedures validated, and your batch testing. Are you actually doing it? So in terms of the root cause, there's 4 main areas that we'll look at. The second one, because I can speak about it for so long, we're not going to do it today because I've only got 25 minutes. But if anyone does want to talk about any water issues they might have, then I'm at stand 32, so you can always come afterwards. But raw materials will be one area. There's storage, transport, and the environment, and then there's operators, which would be the cheapest one that you can fix. So when it comes to raw materials, what should you be considering? So the C of A is always the most important thing. Is there an actual microspec on there? Once you introduced raw materials that are contaminated into your system, that's how you get problems that then don't go away for a long time, and it becomes a bigger problem. And that links in with the storage and handling. So like I mentioned, I do quite a lot of audits. One of my biggest pet peeves is that I go to a site and there'll be bags of powder and they'll leave them open. So it's how are you storing stuff? And I want you to think about that when you think about stores as well, when they're doing refill stations. How are they storing the raw materials that are on site? And have you even tested to make sure that they're safe in the way they've been stored? Typically with dry powders, you're going to get spore-forming organisms, your clays as well. So starch, talc, mica, them kind of products typically have a bioburden with them. And that's why that C of A is really important that you should be checking. You should always be checking that if the sourcing of the raw materials changes. So I've got an anecdote that there was one cosmetic product that an entire production had to be destroyed, and the reason why was because the supplier of one raw material changed to a different part of the world. That part of the world had some struggles going on it, similar to what you see in Ukraine now, and that meant that the quality of raw material that was produced there wasn't as good. But that's something that will be picked up on a C of A, and you wouldn't put that into your system and then risk it. The next one will be storage and transport. So I've skipped water, but briefly to go over it. If your water's dirty, then you should assume that not only is your product always being challenged whenever you're filling it, but the cleaning of your actual vessels, your IBCs, is being impeded as well. So one thing you see a lot of time is that there's, in terms of you'll do your disinfectant of your storage vessel, so for example your IBCs if you're reusing them, and then you'll rinse them afterwards with a jet wash, or a lot of people do it with a jet wash anyway. Are you drying that area? So when it comes to the recalls that I've dealt with this year, there was 3. All 3 of them, the root cause was because in the bottom of those IBCs, in the corners, they weren't dried. And what happens is you get that dirty water it's already got a bioburden in it. It's usually a Pseudomonas species, which is something that forms a biofilm. So like a snot would end up forming, which protects it. And then when you dump product on top of that, that's constant exposure. So in the same way that a doctor would complain because you only used half of your antibiotics and the resistance is formed, in the same way, these organisms become resistant to your preservatives that you use, and eventually your cleaning procedures as well. Another thing that's quite frustrating that you see, and it will link in with the store, is the way equipment is left. So because I'm a microbiologist, when I walk around somewhere and I see a cap that's left off at the bottom, that it annoys me, if I'm being completely honest with you. What do you call it? Because it's something so simple, but Normal people don't think like that. That's just the way I think. In terms of the tops of the IBCs, sometimes they get left open. In one site that I had to deal with, the reason why they had contamination on their site, which was really bad, and it cost a lot of money to fix it, was because a seagull defecated, and it ended up getting into the system at some point in there. So the organism is typically found in that area, so that's how we've linked it to that. So it's really important that you're cleaning your storage or facilities that you have, and any transport facilities you have. The next one would be operators. So these are a key source of your typical 4 specified organisms. So anyone who makes or reviews certificate of analysis with the cosmetic regulation knows that there's 4 organisms that are not allowed to be in a cosmetic product, and that means 1 CFU per gram, which I'll go into why that's very relevant later. But the 4 organisms: Staph aureus, typically found on your skin, causes skin infections; E. coli, typically linked with fecal matter; Pseudomonas aeruginosa, typically with your water; Candida albicans makes prosecco, but it also gives you thrush. So these are things that you could be introducing into the line if you're not training people very well. So for me, this is the cheapest thing to fix. This month alone, I did 5 training sessions with people. That's how you solve this kind of problem. My biggest pet peeve that I have with it is them gloves at the bottom. The amount of people that wear gloves, and they wear gloves all day, they think they're clean. They're not clean. They're one of the most dirtiest things you're going to have. But I also see people going into toilets and coming out of toilets wearing gloves. I've never washed my hands when I've got gloves on. So that E. coli, the fecal matter linked organism, that's how you're getting it into the systems. So it's really important that operators are considered as well. And again, that links with the progressive cosmetics for the shop floor. So who is actually dealing with the raw materials that you're doing and cleaning down? Ultimately, what you're looking for is whenever you do a GMP, whenever you're doing cleaning, is factory isolates, we call them. So I mentioned before the recalls that I've dealt with, the IBCs. It was a normal organism that was there originally, and then due to exposure, it adapted. So it changed over time. These are the organisms that are not in any challenge test, because challenge tests are standard organisms, so there's 5 set organisms if you're following the ISO method. But they're the ones that will cost you money. They're the ones that have already adapted to overcome your systems. Some places they use the same preservative mode of action and the same cleaning material mode of action, which means that once it becomes adapted to one, it becomes adapted to the entire process. So you've really got no defense against it. I think when it comes to the vegan products and natural products, which is the way the markets we know has moved, they tend to be much more milder. So I know there's going to be a panel on microbiome later on, and they'll probably mention about milder preservatives, and that's one of the ways to overcome it. A lot of manufacturing sites that I've been to, that preservative is it's like their safety net that they've relied on for so long. So their water could be absolutely filthy, but they've never had a problem with the actual product because the preservatives that have been put in there are so good that they've never had an issue. But once they've started making a vegan product with these mild preservatives, everything's on the quarantine shelf. So this is one thing that I've really seen is a big trend in the market. So that brings us on to the actual progressive cosmetics. I want you to keep everything that I've already talked about in mind as we go through these things. So reusable packaging is a really big thing that's out at the moment. It's excellent for the environment. What should we be considering? The first thing I would always consider is the shape. So I use that one there, that brown packet. I would say it's probably classed as a very simple packaging, but in reality, from a microbiology perspective, it's got an issue with it in that shelf at the top. So the neck is thinner than the actual bottle itself. What will happen is I can't do the laser, can I? But the gunk will end up building around this rim part here. And that's when it's exactly the same as that IBC issue that was mentioned a minute ago. Eventually what's going to happen is you're going to get growth. Anyone who uses reusable bottles, when you take the wad that's inside there, that's a picture of one that I took, and all that bottle had was water in it. That's actually from our site. Someone was drinking from that. But that's because essentially what's happened is stuff's got behind it, and then it's never been cleaned since. That has been dunked under water, and someone has attempted to clean it, but it's not really picked everything up, and mold's a really big problem that you'll get there as well. The bottom one was just orange juice that was left over a Christmas period, and that managed to grow. So is the packaging easy to clean? And the reason why I think that's relevant to brands is because I remember Jacqueline Hill when I'm going to pick on this launch. I remember when it got launched and it was a lipstick, so low risk product. It had like a fur that was coming out the top of it, which was deemed to be a mold. A lot of people said it was. That destroyed that launch. That brand got destroyed so fast, it was unreal. And in the same way, it only takes a couple, now with social media and everything, it only takes a couple of things that people start doing, that everybody now sends a picture online. This is something that happens really commonly, this growth thing. So is your packaging susceptible to that? That's what you should be considering. And then there's the actual shelf life of the packaging itself. So are you making it out of a soft plastic? Because if it's soft plastic, then it's going to have pores in it eventually. So IBCs, if you send them off for cleaning, typically what they do is they'll check it for the pore size of the actual plastic itself. And the reason why is because we're dealing with microbiology. So the holes you can't see, that's where organisms can grow, and that's when they constantly get exposed again to your products that you're putting inside there. So eventually you end up with an annoying organism. The only good thing about this really is that there'll be individual cases, as opposed to with a manufacturing line, it's an entire batch that would become contaminated. But it's about that negative press that you'll end up getting out of it. So the wear and tear of the packaging, for me, because this is relatively new concept, I think it'll be quite a couple of years before we see the stability data on all of the packagings to see how they actually how they cope. But it is something to consider, because washing is abrasive typically, so you're likely to cause issues. And then I think there's a couple of schemes that I've seen. So some of them that you provide the packaging to the customer's the one who washes it. But what about if you're taking the packaging back? So there's quite a couple of big brands in the UK that I'm aware of that they take the packaging back off you, so they give you a different one. They'll go and wash that, and then, so it's like a cycle. But then the liability is on you to make sure that you got it right. And that's where that drying part really comes in on that part. It's really easy to wash something. It's really difficult to make sure that the residue that's left over is completely removed, especially in certain packaging. So I've seen it with the 5-litre tubs where they got the handle on them. The top part, the handle bit, is really difficult to dry and to make sure that you've actually got in there properly. And that's where that gunk's going to grow up. And that's where validation comes in, that you should really be considering as well. The next, we'll move on to refill stations. So very common nowadays. Typically, they're not made of aqueous products, but if there are aqueous products that are going into them, then they are high risk. There's no doubt about it. That should be considered high risk, because when it comes to the cleaning. But typically, they'll be anhydrous, which is a benefit. But these pumps in particular I'll pick. So if I was on a manufacturing line, one of the things I always ask when I'm dealing with people's waters, so we're dealing with pipe work now, is what valve do you have on the actual, what's the release valve that you're using? So there's a ball and socket one, which is the old school way, so it's like that and it turns like that to release it, and then there's a butterfly valve. The butterfly valve is the more advanced one because it doesn't hold growth in it. But the ball and socket, what happens is the gunk gets behind the ball, and then every time you open it, you flick something out. So typically that's where a biofilm would end up building up. Very difficult to clean them. So if that's what you've got on your site, eventually you might end up with an issue. But you won't know unless you're actually cleaning it, unless you're checking it. So you have to remember who's on site here again. So I've done retail jobs when I was in university. I wasn't thinking about how clean a pipe was. There was no way I'm thinking about that at that time. I probably didn't care enough, if I'm being completely honest with you. But it's really important to think about who's in there. So that's that training of the operators as well, making them think about what could happen. Because all it takes is a couple of people to get a bad product out from your dispenser, and then they'll stop coming, and then you start a trend going on there. But this is the first time that the filling line has finished in a store. It's always been in a factory previously, and there isn't a factory you shouldn't go to a factory that doesn't have a cleaning validation and cleaning procedures in place. So has that even been considered for these stores? What I would say is that my idea on it anyway is that we've all heard of Secret Shopper to check the quality of your service, the Secret Swabber. So one thing that MSL does work with quite a lot of in the biocides industry, fogging is a big thing at the moment. So if you came on the tube today, one of the ways they clean the tube carriages is they put a fogging machine in the middle of it, they fog the entire thing, and then they don't have to mess with it. It usually has a residual effect on it. Gyms have taken up that. Some schools have taken up that as well. So one thing that we do with that is that we call it clean show, where we'll give you swabs and you'll then do the swabbing. You send it back to us, we'll tell you whether it was working or not. So the way that you always check whether the cleaning procedure works is before you swab, find out what the bioburden is, then you swab afterwards, and then find out. If you're claiming that it's clean for 24 hours, then you would then do it again after 24 hours. The next would be condensed cosmetics. So for this, I picked that one there, the Subtract brand. They're probably the lower risk. I have seen liquid-based ones, but it's not the actual product itself necessarily that's the issue here. It's the fact that, again, the finishing line has now gone to somebody's house. So what water are they actually... So you've made it so it's concentrated, but what water quality are you using? So I know some people who've done this that they sell internationally. So the water in America and the water in England are very different trials that come with that. And that means that one probably would fail where another one would pass. You get inconsistent results. The other thing you need to consider as well is that the people that are making it, I know that you might tell them dilute in 100 mils, but if my missus ever asked me to fill the kettle up, I don't check that it goes to that line. How serious is that person going to take that? So are they going to over dilute it? What is the worst case scenario that you can reasonably expect that someone would do? So when I've done this with people before, what we've done is we've done a challenge test on the way it's meant to be made, but we'll also do another challenge test on products that are 10% extra diluted, just to see that it could withstand that. And especially if you're thinking about how we were talking about the more gentle preservatives that are being used, that's how this one would link in. I do think that the normal challenge test is probably not as relevant for these products as for example, there's the PCPC method, which that's more internationally known. There is a cocoa method as well. But with them, they have a much wider range of organisms. In this, factory isolates doesn't really mean anything because you're not going to go to everybody's house and find out what's growing in their house. But you can do extra checks for standard environmental organisms. So previously, the challenge test that's done is basically based off the 4 specified organisms of batch testing, and then there's a mold thrown in there as well to make sure that it's all right. But considering different ways of approaching with that. So what I really want you to consider if you're planning on making a progressive MPD, whether it falls into any of those, the first thing you should be asking is what preservative you're using, because that offers different risks. I've talked about more gentle preservatives, but majority of vegan or natural products require acid-based preservatives. That's probably the most common one that's been being used at the moment. But then I see that the pH of the products are above 5.5. A product that is using an acid-based preservative that goes above 5.5 after the point that the preservative was added no longer has preservative in it, because it gets denatured and then or deactivated and it doesn't work anymore. So you might have put it in, but it ain't there. Then there's the packaging. Is it easy to clean? What are the risks that I have with it? Is it strong? Then you should be thinking who prepares it. So is it a store? Is it a manufacturing site? Is it a person who's making it at home? And equally, who buys it? So who is it aimed at? So obviously there's high-risk products, low-risk products. Are you applying it on the eyes? Then you should be doing extra testing just to make sure that you have covered all your areas, because if something goes wrong, it's going to be a much worse thing that goes wrong. And then what's the actual PAO of these products? So these condensed cosmetics, you've probably said dispose after 2 weeks or however long it is that you said it. Where did you get that figure from? How have you actually worked that out? And then finally, there's the instructions. How clear are you on using them? So mentioned that water thing before. One of the things that I've seen a brand do is that they use distilled water. I don't have a distillery in my house, so it's a bit inconvenient. But there are other options. So maybe is it you boil your water first that you use it. So you could put in extra instructions there. So the whole point is it's progressive, it's meant to be new, but these are just considerations that you can go through. I'm trying to blitz through it so I don't stay here for hours, because I could just waffle on forever. So that leads us on to the next thing, which is why we actually test, or what is the purpose of all this. So the number one reason is meant to be consumer safety. That's why we get a CPSR. That's why we do all the testing to make sure that everything works with its validation, whether it's making sure that the manufacturing site is up to standard. But in reality, I know that the reason why is brand protection and cost effectiveness. I have been to so many sites that have issues that don't deal with the issue because the CFO has not seen the dent in the budget yet, so they won't deal with it, and that's so ultimately it's what's most cost effective. When it comes to microbiology, The rule is it's much cheaper, as much as it might not seem like this, to deal with it at the beginning than it is at the end. For example, a water system, if you get contamination in it at the beginning, you could dose it and you could get rid of it. But if you allow a biofilm to build up, even if you shut down the site, dismantle everything, then clean it, then put it back together, if you missed one little bit, or there's still that dead leg that's there that you didn't notice was there, or the gradient wasn't right, or the bend was down rather than up, it comes back. So it's much easier to control things at the beginning. So when it comes to the actual testing of your products, you've got to consider there's different products, and there's also a wide range of tests that you do. Typically, I found the bigger the brand, the more testing they actually do, which I actually thought would have been the reverse way around. I had one guy who said to me once that we don't need to do as much testing because we have an entire legal department that deals with all of the complaints that we have that brush everything under the carpet. I don't think that's the best way to go about it, if I'm being honest with you. And I also don't think that not every company has access to that and wants to risk that. But there are a wide range of testing, so it's very difficult to actually maybe pick what testing it is that you want. So where do you start? The first thing you should always do is risk assessment. There is an actual standard for that. That's ISO 29621. It's got the literature there. The whole point of when you come into safety is that, have I argued enough that this product is safe? Because if it goes wrong and you've done your due diligence, well, there's nothing you can do about that, really, is there? So that's already done the research for you. There's 3 steps, really. You can go for the inherently low risk. So if something has hydrogen peroxide more than 3%, if it has alcohol more than 20%, these products, they don't need challenge testing. You don't even need to do batch testing on some things, but you might want to do it sporadically to make sure that your systems are in place correctly. The next would be, or the most common one, would be water activity. So I get a lot of products that come, oils, butters, balms, and they can be approached different ways. So I've seen butters that have allowed Candida albicans in particular to grow in them. So that water activity argument, we didn't do a water activity test on it initially, but it was on the borderline, it actually ended up turning out. So just saying something has low water activity because I've not added any water to it is not always the correct approach, and you should be considering that. Balms are actually better in that typically they're hot poured. If you combine a hot pour with, so that means above 65 degrees at the point of pouring it, or held for 10 minutes at 65 degrees, and the water activity is low, then you don't need to do any testing on it whatsoever. It does mention in that standard that you might want to do it sporadically to check, but you don't. So that's a different approach that you would have for the butter, for example. And then everything else should be going to the challenge testing. Typically, everyone will do the standard methods. More old school people will do the European Pharmacopoeia 5.1.3. It has that 48-hour time point in there. But ISO 11930 was a standard that was developed for cosmetics. And it's probably in the middle of the USP and the European Pharmacopoeia. The European Pharmacopoeia is slightly stricter. The USP is a bit too lenient. And then ISO 11930 sits in the middle. There are additional testing that you could do. So, for example, a powder. About 6 years ago, there was like an epidemic of compacts that had mold growth on them. That we had to deal with them anyway. I tend to only get involved if there's a problem, so I tend to see trends. And that could have been solved by doing something like a surface mold test. So powders typically will have preservatives in them. And there's a reason for that is that when the water gets added to it, which is inevitable, especially if it's hygroscopic, so it draws water from the air, then it still will not allow spores, which are typically found in talc and mica, to grow. So that's where you might just do a test like that just to make sure. How do you determine your PAO? Typically that's with age testing. And again, it's that point of the factory isolates. They're the organisms that you don't need to include, but they're more important than any other organism that you're going to use. The Staph aureus, I always use that as the example, that was isolated from a factory that's over 100 years old. It probably doesn't exist anymore. So it's relevant as like an indicator, but it's not the most relevant to you. So in here I've got some examples. So the oil-based products, Magic's like them lip balms there, you wouldn't need to do any testing. Even though it doesn't have a preservative in it, you don't need to do any testing in it. It's hot poured and it's low water activity. That 2-in-1 shampoo, imagine it's in them bottles because the packaging does matter. You would have to do a challenge test, but you could pass criteria B of an ISO 11930 challenge test. and that's because the packaging offers additional protection outside of the formulation. Nail polish, alcohol-based, if it's more than 20%, you don't need to worry about it. If it's got an organic solvent in it as well, then you usually don't. That's another low-risk characteristic. And then, of course, pressed powder, I mentioned it a minute ago, you might want to do a surface mold on it as an additional test. The next one is, we've moved from the MPD stage now to batch testing. Everybody does this test, which is the enumeration test. The problem with this test is what actually happens is you take 1 gram from the product and then you add it to 9 grams or 9 mils of a diluent, a deactivator, which removes the preservative ability of it. And then you'll take 1 gram of that and you'll put it onto a plate. And that's when you get growth like that. Because of that dilution factor, it means that you cannot detect less than 10. So every result that you get, if you get a count of 1, you times it by 10. So the minimum result you'll get is less than 10. That means that if there was, say, 4 CFU per mil in there, so 4 organisms per mil in there, 6 out of 10 of the times we wouldn't pick it up statistically. And that's an issue for the next stage, which is detection. So at the bottom here is actually taken from the SECS Notes of Guidance. They reference it. And what it says is that you have to have less than a certain amount depending on the product in terms of counting, but you have to have less than 1 per a gram of product. And you can't guarantee that based on the first test. You have to do this test on top as well. And it's really important because what this test does as well, especially if you follow that 18415 method, it does non-specified organisms. So if you have an organism that's growing in your factory, it will start off in a weakened state typically, so it will come out on this test, but it will not come out on this test. So what you should be doing is noticing that you're getting a lot of presence, find out what that is. That helps you find the root cause of the problem as well, so you can solve it. But you can add that then to your challenge testing, and that way you're future-proofing your products. So that's all the testing done. There's also an alternative now. So we're talking about progressive again. Vegan Shore is something that's been in development since 2018. It's grown. There's blue chip companies that have taken it. There's small companies that have taken it. Ultimately, what's happened is we've developed, we're the first lab to develop and first lab to be registered with the Vegan Society as well. Testing that covers everything you would need to do from a manufacturing point of view for a cosmetic. So one thing you can say is that my product is completely vegan. It's not just vegan formulated. And because it's UCAS accredited, because it's registered with the Vegan Society, you know that you've got quality assured from both perspectives. So what have we actually done with that? What we did is, so one of the common ingredients in the microbiology testing is pancreatic enzymes, which are typically taken from cows, from abattoirs. So what we've done is we've substituted those ingredients out, and we've used peas would be possibly one of the things we've used in there, but we've used synthetics and we've used naturals to replace them. In terms of the actual testing service that comes under Vegan Shore, so that's all the testing that you need for a cosmetic, we've actually separated it on our site in terms of the glassware, the separate pipettes, the separate everything. And the beauty of this is there's no deviation from your standard methods. One of the biggest questions that I get asked is, how is this different from the ISO 11930 test? It's not. It's exactly the same. So the report is accepted exactly the same as well. The only difference is the media is different, and that's not strictly said anyway inside. Only suggestions are made within the standards. So in terms of why, so I've got to do a bit of sales pitch, I guess, what you call it. Why would you guys even be interested in this? So in the London Underground at the moment, I saw this on LinkedIn, I've not actually took the Underground, but you'll see there's a Tropic Skincare advert. And one thing I found really interested on it was that square there, and it says, vegan and cruelty-free, old news. And the reality is, vegan is quite old news. If we're talking about vegan formula, it is quite old news. Every single company's doing it now, and it's just become pretty much a standard. So what is new? The new is the testing. So one thing that MSL offers through Vegan Shore is that you can actually use the logo in your marketing to show that you are not only vegan formulated, but you're vegan testing as well. We didn't put a premium on it because I know with vegan products that there is always a premium put on it. Now, one agreement that MSL made with the Vegan Society when we were developing it was we won't do that. So what we did is we've kept it exactly the same price as a normal test. So ultimately, there's no other decision to make other than, do you want to future-proof? That's the way I see it. Because whether or not you're seeing that you want to put it on the marketing. Now, I've had a company that has been doing the testing with us since the early days, about 2019, and only now are they saying to me, can we use your logo in our marketing? So they've future-proofed all their products, so they can go to that if they want to, if they see that there's an opportunity there. Another thing that we've changed that's specific for this year is that we now offer the media to you guys. So if you're an in-house testing place, or even if you're a competitor to MSL and you want to buy vegan media so you can start testing it in that way, we now offer that option to you. So in terms of the medias that we've got, the top ones, I've put them together so it's easier. The top ones cover all the mandatory testing. If you want to go into the R&D side of things, we've done there. We're constantly expanding. But one thing I would say that's different in a USP for MSL in this one is I actually should have brought one with me really, but that packet there is what it actually looks like. That's how you would buy it. So typically, anyone who's bought media, you get it in a giant plastic tub. And the plastic tub, what you do, it'll say add 39 grams to 1 litre of water. And you'd have to weigh that out. You constantly open it up, you constantly close it. If you're a lab that doesn't do that much testing, then eventually what happens is it can clump up, that hygroscopic issue. We've pre-weighed them into single shots, so all you need to do is rip off the top, pour it out, autoclave it, it's done. And also in terms of the environmental side, we've thought about that. So rather than using plastic, we've actually, all of our packaging is made out of recyclable material, and it's biodegradable as well. So it makes it kind of a no-brainer, really, if you're planning on making any changes. So that's everything. Does anybody have any questions?